The moment the church doors exploded open, everyone inside knew this was no ordinary interruption. 6 men wearing blue bandanas burst into the small Los Angeles chapel, their boots echoing against the worn wooden floors like thunder announcing a storm. The mourners, dressed in black and clutching rosaries, gasped in unison as the intruders raised their weapons, not to fire, but to make a statement. At the front of the church, near the closed mahogany casket, surrounded by white lilies, an elderly priest froze mid-prayer, his trembling hands still raised toward heaven. The late afternoon sunlight filtered through stained glass windows, casting colored shadows across faces now frozen in terror. Outside, the distant hum of traffic continued, as if the world beyond these walls remained untouched by the violence seeping through every crack. Inside, time itself seemed to hold its breath. The leader stepped forward, a tall man with scars mapping a brutal history across his knuckles and neck. His voice cut through the sacred silence, like a blade through silk, demanding answers about a shipment that had vanished without a trace. He claimed someone in this room knew where millions in contraband had disappeared, and he would burn the entire building down to find the truth. His eyes scanned the crowd of mourners, searching for any flicker of recognition, any hint of guilt or knowledge. When no one spoke, he turned his attention to the casket, approaching it with deliberate, measured steps. The mourners watched in horror as he placed one scarred hand on the polished wood, threatening to tear open what should remain forever sealed. His voice dropped to a venomous whisper, promising that even the dead would not escape. His justice. Then, cutting through the tension like a knife, a voice emerged from the front row. An elderly woman with silver hair and weathered hands slowly rose to her feet, her black dress rustling in the suffocating silence. Rosa stood with a dignity that seemed impossible, given the weapons pointed in her direction, her dark eyes meeting the gang leader's glare without flinching. She spoke calmly, her accented English steady despite the chaos, offering to open the casket herself. The room held its collective breath as she claimed her son, the man they were mourning, knew where the shipment was hidden. But first, she insisted, there was a promise she needed to honor. A story the gang leader needed to hear. Rosa's hands trembled, not from fear, but from the weight of a secret she had carried for 23 days. She moved toward the casket with the slow grace of a woman who had buried too many sons, her rosary beads clicking softly against her palm like tiny heartbeats. The gang leader watched her through narrowed eyes, his weapon still raised, uncertain whether this old woman was brave or simply broken by grief. The other mourners remained frozen in their pews, witnesses to a moment that felt suspended between prayer and catastrophe. Rosa placed both palms flat against the coffin's surface, feeling the cool wood beneath her fingertips, and closed her eyes as if gathering strength from somewhere beyond this room. When she spoke again, her voice carried the quiet authority of someone who had survived storms these young men could never imagine. She told them that before revealing what lay inside, they needed to understand the promise she made to her son the night before he died. The gang leader stepped, and closer, his scarred face inches from Rosa's, his breath hot with impatience and rage. He demanded she stop stalling, that he had no interest in the sentimental words of a grieving mother. But Rosa didn't flinch, her weathered face a mask of dignified resistance that came from decades of protecting what she loved. She explained that Miguel had made her swear to trust him completely, even if nothing made sense, even if the world told her to do otherwise. Her words hung in the air like incense, filling the chapel with something the gang members couldn't quite name, a maternal strength that had outlasted violence, poverty, and loss. The other intruders shifted uncomfortably, their weapons suddenly feeling heavier in their hands, as this small woman commanded the room with nothing but her presence. Rosa's eyes glistened with unshed tears, yet her jaw remained set, a portrait of someone who had learned that true power doesn't announce itself with guns or threats. She moved her hands to the casket's brass latches, her fingers working. Slowly, deliberately, as if opening a door to another world. The metallic clicks echoed through the chapel like countdown, each one pulling every eye toward that mahogany box and its mysterious contents. The chapel seemed to fold back in time as Rosa's trembling fingers touched the casket, and in her mind she was no longer standing in this moment of terror, but transported to a memory 15 years old. Miguel had been just 23 when he first told her about joining the police academy, his eyes bright with purpose in their cramped kitchen that smelled of cilantro and hope. She remembered how her heart had clenched with pride and fear in equal measure, knowing her son wanted to walk into the very darkness that had already claimed her eldest boy to gang violence. The gang members watching her now had no idea they were threatening the mother of the man who had sat at their tables, laughed at their jokes, and earned their trust while wearing a wire beneath his shirt. Miguel had spent 7 years living a double life, so convincing that even Rosa sometimes forgot which version of her son would walk through her door each night. The flashback deepened as Rosa recalled the evening 3 weeks ago, when Miguel arrived at her home with eyes that carried the weight of terrible knowledge. He had held her hands across the kitchen table, those same strong hands that once helped her knead masa for tamales, now calloused from handling weapons and hardened by witnessing unspeakable things. He told her about the missing shipment, about how the gang leadership suspected a traitor in their ranks, and about the dangerous plan he and his DEA handlers had conceived. Rosa had listened in silence as her son explained that he needed to die, at least on paper, at least long enough to make the monsters believe they were safe. She had wanted to scream, to forbid him, to lock him in her home like when he was a child, but instead she looked into his determined face and saw the man she had raised to stand against injustice. That night, Miguel made her promise to trust him completely, even when logic screamed otherwise, even when grief would feel devastatingly real. Now, as her fingers worked the brass latches before an audience of killers, Rosa understood that her son had never truly left her. The funeral they were desecrating was a trap baited with love and sacrifice, and she was the guardian of its terrible secret. Every Sunday Mass she had attended, every rosary she had prayed while Miguel lived among wolves, every sleepless night wondering if her son would forget who he really was, it had all led to this moment. She could feel Miguel's presence somewhere in this chapel, hidden but watching, waiting for her to play her part in his dangerous resurrection. The gang members saw only an old woman opening her son's coffin, but Rosa knew she was actually opening the door to their judgment, and her hands stopped trembling because she finally understood that grief could be weaponized by those brave enough to wield it. The final latch clicked open, and Rosa lifted her eyes to meet the gang leader's stare with a strength that transcended fear. The casket lid lifted with a whisper of aged wood against satin lining, and the chapel seemed to inhale collectively as Rosa's weathered hands revealed the interior. Where a body should have rested in eternal peace, there lay only a neatly folded police uniform, its badge catching the dim candlelight like a fallen star against navy fabric. Beside it sat a small digital recorder, red light blinking steadily like a patient heartbeat, and a manila envelope, thick with documents that promised truths no one in this room wanted exposed. Rosa's face remained a mask of dignified sorrow, even as she watched the gang leader's expression shift. From anticipation to confusion, his tattooed fingers gripping his weapon tighter as his mind worked to understand the emptiness before him. The silence stretched thin as wire until Rosa lifted the badge with both hands, holding it up like a holy relic before the assembled criminals. Her voice emerged steady and clear, carrying the weight of mountains and the softness of morning prayer when she spoke in her native tongue before switching to English. My son wanted you to know who really shared your meals, who really listened to your secrets, who really knew where your money disappeared. She pressed the button on the recorder, and a familiar voice filled the chapel. one of their own. Commanders, confessing to federal agents about shipments, murders, and betrayals that reached into the heart of their brotherhood. The gang members exchanged glances sharp as broken glass, trust shattering in real time as they realized the depth of infiltration that had hollowed out their organization. Rosa watched recognition dawn across hardened faces as they understood Miguel had been a ghost among them, documenting their crimes with the patience of someone who understood that justice sometimes required years of sacrifice. She saw the gang leader's jaw clench as the recording continued, revealing not just Miguel's investigation, but a network of informants that had turned their fortress into a house of cards. The documents spilled from her hands onto the casket's white satin, photographs and transaction records, cascading like judgment itself, each page another nail in the coffin of their criminal empire. Her son had transformed his own funeral into a courtroom, and she stood as his witness, her spine straight with the pride of mothers who raise warriors instead of victims. The chapel's air grew thick with the electricity of cornered predators, realizing the trap had already closed. Rosa stepped back from the casket, her role as messenger complete, and in that moment she embodied every mother who had ever stood between violence and truth. Her eyes held no fear, only the ancient power of women who have buried children and refused to let their deaths be meaningless. The gang members began looking toward exits, toward each other, toward any escape from the revelation that their brotherhood had been broken long before this confrontation. The heavy wooden doors of the chapel slammed shut with a sound like thunder, trapped in stone, and the ancient iron locks clicked into place from outside with mechanical precision that echoed through the sacred space. Every head turned toward the entrance as realization dawned. They were sealed inside, the hunters suddenly caged with their prey. The gang members rushed to the doors, shoulders slamming against oak that had withstood a century of storms, fists pounding against wood that refused to yield. Then, from the confessional booth at the chapel's eastern wall, came the creak of an opening door, and a figure emerged from shadows like a man stepping out of his own grave. Miguel stood before them, alive and solid, wearing a bulletproof vest over a simple black shirt, his face bearing the calm expression of someone who had already made peace with whatever came next. The chapel erupted into chaos as weapons swung toward this resurrection, angry voices overlapping in confusion and rage, while Miguel raised both hands slowly, showing he carried no gun. His voice cut through the noise with the authority of someone who had earned respect in their world before betraying it. The building is surrounded by federal agents, 20 on each side, snipers on the roofs across the street, negotiators waiting for my signal. He took 3 measured steps forward, each footfall deliberate as a heartbeat. His eyes scanning faces he had shared meals with, laughed with pretended to call brothers. Rosa watched her son with fierce pride, radiating from her weathered features, this child she had raised to stand against darkness, even when it meant walking through fire. Miguel continued, his words measured and clear. You came here hunting answers about your missing shipment, but what you found instead was the truth about who I really am. The gang members formed a tighter cluster, their brotherhood contracting like wounded flesh around a blade, weapons still drawn, but uncertainty replacing their earlier confidence. Miguel gestured to the recorder still playing softly, to the documents scattered across the empty casket like autumn leaves bearing a terrible knowledge. Every deal, every name, every location, 3 years of evidence that cannot be erased or burned or disappeared like your enemies. His gaze found his mother's across the space between them, and something unspoken passed through that look, the wordless communication of people bound by blood and sacrifice. Outside, the wail of approaching sirens grew louder, a howling mechanical wolf pack closing in, and red and blue lights began painting the stained glass windows in colors that spoke of judgment rather than salvation. The gang leader's face transformed from confusion to cold fury as understanding crystallized into bitter clarity. The funeral had never been about mourning, but about gathering. Miguel had used their own ruthlessness against them, exploiting their need to project power and extract revenge to lure them into a space with no escape. The other gang members looked to their leader, waiting for direction in this impossible situation, their loyalty still intact despite the walls closing around them. The gang leader moved with serpent speed, his arm hooking around Rosa's throat before anyone could react. The cold steel of his pistol pressing against her temple with enough force to indent the paper-thin skin. Rosa's body went rigid, but her eyes remained steady. That same unwavering calm she had shown throughout this orchestrated chaos, as if she had prepared herself for this exact moment long before entering the chapel. Miguel's composure shattered like dropped glass, his hands reaching forward instinctively while his voice cracked with raw desperation that no amount of training could suppress. The other mourners gasped and recoiled, pressing themselves against pews and walls, while federal agents outside surely watched through scopes and cameras, their fingers hovering over triggers, waiting for a signal that could mean salvation or tragedy. The gang leader's breath came hot and rapid against Rosa's ear, his body coiled with the trapped animal fury of someone who suddenly understood the cage had closed. The recorded confession continued playing from the casket like a ghost bearing witness, while Miguel stood frozen in his personal nightmare made flesh, the decorated agent reduced to a terrified son, watching his mother held at gunpoint. "You think you're clever, traitor!" The gang leader spat, his voice thick with venom and something deeper, something that tasted like betrayal, sharp enough to cut bone. Miguel's training screamed at him to stay calm, to negotiate, to remember his tactical advantages, but all he could see was his mother's fragile body. All he could imagine was the single twitch of a finger that would erase her from existence. Rosa's hands hung loose at her sides, not grasping at the arm across her throat, not showing the panic that would be so natural, so human, so expected in these final seconds before potential oblivion. The standoff stretched like pulled wire, tension building toward the breaking point where metal fails and everything collapses, while outside the sirens had gone silent, that terrible quiet before storms. Break. Miguel's greatest fear crystallized into this frozen moment, that his pursuit of justice would cost him the one person who taught him what justice truly meant, that his mother would pay the price for his choices. The other gang members watched their leader with uncertain eyes, some nodding approval, while others showed the first cracks of doubt, their weapons trained on Miguel, but their commitment wavering. Time itself seemed to hold its breath in that sacred space, waiting to see if blood would sanctify or desecrate these ancient stones. "You want your evidence, your arrests, your victory?" the gang leader continued, his gun hand steady despite the rage shaking through his frame. Like electrical current through water, Miguel calculated angles and distances, years of tactical training overlaying his vision with trajectories and probabilities, none of them offering certainty, all of them gambling with his mother's life as the stake. Rosa's lips moved slightly, forming words too quiet for anyone but her captor to hear. Some whispered secret passing between hostage and holder that made the gang leader's eyes widen. The atmosphere shifted subtly, some invisible weight redistributing across the chapel's charged air, as if those silent words carried power beyond their volume. Miguel saw the change ripple through his enemy's posture, saw muscles tense differently, saw the calculation behind cold eyes, suddenly interrupted by something unexpected, something that looked almost like recognition. The federal agents outside surely had shots lined up, fingers on triggers, waiting for Miguel's signal or the gang leader's mistake, balanced on the knife edge between rescue and disaster. Rosa's whispered words fell like stones into still water, creating ripples that would change everything in their expanding circles of consequence. "I forgave you at another funeral, Diego," she breathed in Spanish, her voice carrying the weight of 15 years compressed into a single moment of recognition. "My Tomas, my first son, he died with your friend Marco when the bullets found them both on that corner, and you came to me afterward, a boy drowning in guilt, asking why I didn't curse you for bringing my child into that life." The gang leader's grip loosened imperceptibly, his breathing pattern shifting from predatory aggression to something more jagged, more human, more broken. Miguel watched his enemy's certainty crumble like sun-dried clay, saw the hardened criminal facade crack to reveal the lost young man who had stood trembling in a cemetery so long ago. Rosa continued speaking with the quiet authority of someone who had walked through fire and emerged carrying wisdom instead of weapons, her words more powerful than any tactical advantage. "You wept at my feet that day, Diego Hernandez, and I told you that hatred would only multiply the graves, that forgiveness was the only seed that could grow anything but more death," Rosa said, her voice strengthening despite the gun still pressed against her temple. The gang leader's hand began to tremble visibly now, the pistol wavering as memory warred. With present circumstance, as the scared 19-year-old, he had been fought against the hardened criminal he had become. Around them, the other gang members shifted uncertainly, confused by their leader's sudden paralysis, by the inexplicable power this elderly woman wielded with nothing but remembered kindness. Miguel stood frozen between hope and terror, watching his mother perform a miracle he couldn't have orchestrated with all his training and planning. The recording had stopped playing, leaving only breathing and whispered Spanish floating through incense-thick air like prayers seeking somewhere to land. Rosa's clemency 15 years ago had planted something in Diego's soul that never quite died, despite all the violence and choices that followed. "I never forgot you, Senora," Diego whispered back, his voice cracking with the weight of buried conscience suddenly unearthed. "That day you should have spit on me, cursed me, destroyed me with your grief, but instead you touched my face and called me Mijo, and I felt human. For the first time since joining these streets," tears carved clean paths down his tattooed face, each drop washing away another layer of the armor he had built between that cemetery and this chapel. The gun lowered slightly, then more, trembling in a grip that had lost its certainty, while Rosa remained perfectly still, giving him space for transformation. Miguel saw the impossible unfolding before him, redemption arriving not through force, but through the persistent memory of grace, given when vengeance would have been justified. This humble woman who had buried one son and pretended to bury another was now saving them both, with nothing but the truth of who she had always chosen to be. The recognition washed over Diego like baptismal water, drowning the hardened criminal in memories of the boy he once was, the moment when a grieving mother's mercy had cracked something open inside his concrete heart. His hands trembled with increasing intensity as the present collided with the past, as the chapel around him dissolved into that cemetery 15 years ago, where Rosa had knelt beside him despite her own unbearable loss, choosing compassion when revenge would have been righteous. The other gang members watched their leader's transformation with confusion bleeding into unease, seeing their invincible commander reduced to tears by an elderly woman's whispered truth. Witnessing power they couldn't understand or control, Miguel held his breath, every instinct screaming to move, yet something deeper, telling him to remain still, to let this sacred moment unfold without tactical interference or strategic calculation. The gun continued its descent, lowering inch by trembling inch as Diego's fingers lost their grip on both the weapon and the identity he had constructed through years of violence and choices that had buried his humanity beneath layers of survival and cruelty. "You told me I could still choose differently, that one act of violence didn't have to define my entire existence," Diego said, his voice breaking like adolescent thunder, raw and uncontrolled. Rosa nodded slowly, her eyes holding his with the same gentle strength that had reached him across his friend's grave all those years ago when forgiveness seemed impossible and grace felt like fiction. The tattooed tears on Diego's face now had companions of real salt water, genuine remorse flowing from somewhere he thought had died. Long before this moment of reckoning arrived, his men shifted restlessly, hands moving toward weapons as their pack structure began fracturing, as loyalty confronted something more powerful than brotherhood forged in blood and territory. Miguel watched the careful calculation in their eyes, saw some recognizing an opportunity for power, while others simply looked lost without their leader's certainty guiding them through moral ambiguity. The chapel had become a crucible where souls were being tested, where the choices made in the next heartbeat would determine whether Rosa's long-ago mercy would multiply or be extinguished by those who had never tasted forgiveness's transformative power. "Stand down," Diego commanded suddenly, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had just remembered who he was before the streets claimed him. The weapon clattered to the floor as he released it completely, the sound echoing through sacred space, like a judge's gavel declaring a verdict on his entire violent existence. He raised his and slowly, palms open toward the ceiling, toward whatever divine presence might witness this surrender, this choice to honor the woman who had planted redemption's seed when he was still young enough for it to take root, despite hostile soil. Some of his men immediately moved to obey, dropping their weapons with relief, washing across their faces, like they had been waiting for permission to stop being monsters. Others hesitated, exchanging glances loaded with rebellion and calculation, unwilling to abandon the only identity that had ever given them belonging or purpose, in a world that had discarded them before they could even read. Miguel saw the fracture spreading through the gang's unity, saw former brothers dividing into those who would choose transformation and those who would cling to violence because it was the only language they had ever truly mastered or trusted. The confrontation erupted in Spanish curses and shouted accusations as Diego's second-in-command raised his weapon toward his former leader, calling him traitor and coward, unable to comprehend how decades of loyalty could be undone by an old woman's memory. Diego stepped in front of Rosa instinctively, his body becoming her shield, choosing protection over self-preservation in a movement that completed his transformation from captor to guardian. Miguel moved simultaneously, his training finally released into action as federal agents breached the doors in coordinated precision, flooding the chapel with commands and tactical efficiency. The gang members who had chosen surrender kept their hands raised, while those who refused scattered like shadows before dawn. Some captured immediately, while others fought briefly before overwhelming force made resistance futile. Through it all, Rosa stood calm and unbowed, this humble mother who had buried sons and planted forgiveness, who had faced death with dignity and transformed her enemy with nothing but remembered grace, proving that sometimes the greatest strength belongs to those who choose mercy when violence would be easier, who water seeds of redemption, even when harvest seems generations away. The chapel's sacred air fractured into chaos as Diego's second-in-command, a scarred veteran named Flaco, swung his pistol toward the man who had led them through a decade of blood and territory wars, his face contorted with betrayal that ran deeper than any wound. "You choose this, Vieja, over your brothers, over everything we built with our own hands?" Flaco's voice cracked with genuine anguish, the pain of abandonment mixing with rage in his eyes that had witnessed too many funerals and not enough mercy. Diego remained positioned between the weapon and Rosa, his arms spread wide like a human cross, his body language speaking a truth his former brothers could read, even if his transformation remained incomprehensible to their hardened hearts. The other gang members divided visibly, some lowering their weapons with expressions mixing relief and confusion, while others tightened their grips and shifted their stances into combat readiness that came from muscle, memory forged in countless street battles. Rosa's weathered hand reached out and gently touched Diego's shoulder, her small gesture containing oceans of forgiveness and recognition, acknowledging the courage required to break from the only family he had known since childhood, claimed his innocence. Miguel calculated angles and trajectories with trained precision, yet something in his mother's calm presence made him pause, trusting her wisdom, even as his federal training screamed intervention, believing that some moments belonged to grace rather than tactical response. The confrontation reached its breaking point when Flaco advanced 3 steps forward, his weapon now aimed directly at Diego's chest, demanding his leader return to the man he was supposed to be, or die as the traitor he had become. She showed me mercy when I deserved nothing, when I was standing over my best friend's grave with his blood still on my hands, Diego said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of 15 years of buried memory finally surfacing into light and truth. The words hit Flaco like physical blows, and something flickered behind his rage. Recognition, perhaps, or the ghost of his own lost innocence haunting his present choices with uncomfortable questions he had spent years avoiding. 2 gang members suddenly stepped between Flaco and Diego, their loyalty choosing redemption over violence, their bodies becoming shields just as their leader had shielded Rosa, creating a human barrier that spoke of brotherhood transcending criminal bonds. The chapel doors exploded inward with synchronized precision as federal agents in tactical gear flooded the sacred space, their commands sharp and authoritative, their movements choreographed through countless training scenarios that never quite captured the complexity of real human moments unfolding in unpredictable patterns. Miguel moved with them, but positioned himself protectively near his mother, his professional training merging with filial devotion in movements that honored both his badge and his blood, his weapon raised, but his finger resting safely outside the trigger guard because some part of him still believed in his mother's transformative power. The sanctuary transformed into controlled chaos as gang members scattered into fight-or-flight responses, some dropping immediately to their knees with hands raised in surrender that looked almost like prayer, while others bolted toward exits that agents had already sealed with tactical efficiency born from experience with cornered predators. Flaco stood frozen in his rage and confusion, his weapon still extended, but his purpose crumbling as the world he understood dissolved around him, as brothers he had bled beside chose mercy over loyalty to codes written in violence and enforced through fear. Diego remained motionless with arms still spread, offering himself to whatever judgment came next, legal, divine, or the bullet from his former second, who struggled visibly with the decision between murder and surrender. Rosa began humming softly, a hymn her own mother had sung during their family's darkest hours, the melody cutting through shouted commands and metallic clicks of handcuffs with something older than law or gang allegiance, something that spoke to the frightened children still living inside these hardened men. The sound reached Flaco first, and his gun hand wavered as the hymn unlocked memories of his grandmother's kitchen, where innocence still existed, where violence was something that happened to other people in other places, far from the warmth of fresh tortillas and unconditional love. When Flaco's weapon finally clattered to the tile floor, the sound echoed like a period ending a long, brutal sentence that had consumed too many lives and buried too many possibilities beneath concrete and pride. He collapsed to his knees, not in surrender to the federal agents surrounding him, but in exhaustion from carrying hatred's unbearable weight for so many years without rest or relief, his body shaking with sobs that came from somewhere deeper than any wound he had ever received in street warfare. Diego moved to him immediately, kneeling beside his former brother and placing one hand on his shoulder, offering the same mercy Rosa had extended across a grave 15 years ago, when forgiveness seemed impossible and grace felt like weakness. The agents moved efficiently through the chapel, securing weapons and securing suspects, but even their professional hardness softened slightly, witnessing this moment where enemies became humans again, where justice arrived accompanied by something larger than punishment or revenge. Miguel holstered his weapon and went to his mother, who stood calm and radiant in her simple black dress. This extraordinary woman, disguised as an ordinary mourner, this architect of redemption, who had transformed a funeral into a resurrection. Rosa smiled up at her son, with eyes containing both pride and profound sadness, knowing that while this battle was won, the war against violence would continue long after. Today's grace faded into tomorrow's harsh realities and difficult choices. The autumn sun filtered through stained glass windows as Miguel adjusted his tie outside St. Teresa's chapel. The same nervous gesture his mother had corrected at his own father's funeral decades ago, when he was just a boy, learning that grief wore many faces and carried unexpected weight. Rosa stood beside him in a navy dress, her silver hair pinned elegantly, her weathered hands clutching a simple bouquet of white roses that she had grown in her own garden with patient devotion throughout the changing seasons. Inside the chapel, they could hear the priest's gentle Spanish cadence, offering comfort to the mourners gathered for a woman who had raised her son alone in a neighborhood where survival itself was a daily victory. Against overwhelming odds, Miguel glanced at his mother, whose eyes held that familiar mixture of sorrow and purpose, the same expression she wore when she stood in this very building 3 years ago and changed the trajectory of countless lives with nothing but mercy and memory. The funeral program in his hand read simply, "Maria Herrera, beloved, mother and faithful servant." But Miguel knew the story ran deeper than any printed words could capture or any single ceremony could honor. Rosa squeezed his arm gently, sensing his hesitation about entering a space where former enemies would gather to acknowledge shared humanity despite history written in violence and regret. Together they walked through the chapel doors, their footsteps echoing against tile floors that still remembered the day when grace interrupted vengeance and transformation began, with a grandmother's hymn cutting through chaos like light through darkness. Diego sat in the front pew wearing a simple grey suit, his tattoos hidden beneath long sleeves, his posture carrying the dignity of a man who had spent 3 years earning redemption, one difficult day at a time, through community service and restorative justice programs. His mother's casket rested peacefully before the altar, surrounded by flowers from neighbors who remembered her kindness, from former gang members whose lives she had touched through her. Zun's unexpected transformation, from families who had lost children to violence and somehow found room in their hearts for forgiveness. When Diego noticed Miguel and Rosa entering, he stood immediately, his eyes filling with tears that no longer brought shame, but instead testified to his reclaimed humanity and hard-won emotional honesty. Rosa moved directly to him, her small frame approaching this man who once held a gun to her head, and she embraced him with the same fierce maternal love she had shown her own son through every trial and triumph. Miguel watched this moment, understanding finally what his mother had known instinctively that day in the chapel, that mercy was not weakness, but the strongest force available to human hearts, willing to carry its transformative weight. Diego whispered something in Spanish to Rosa, gratitude mixed with grief, and she responded by placing her hand over his heart the way she did when Miguel was young and frightened, a gesture communicating that he was seen, valued, and forever changed. The service unfolded with quiet reverence, stories shared of Maria's life, painting pictures of sacrifice and love that sustained her son even through his darkest years when violence seemed like destiny and redemption appeared impossible. Flaco attended from the back row, released early for good behavior and genuine transformation, his scarred face now carrying different marks, the kind that came from facing yourself honestly in mirrors that reflected uncomfortable truths, requiring courage to acknowledge. Several former gang members sat scattered throughout the chapel, some still serving sentences but granted permission to attend, others rebuilding lives in communities they once terrorized, all united by the recognition that Maria had indirectly saved them by raising a son who chose surrender over bloodshed. Miguel noticed how Diego's shoulders shook during the eulogy. This man who had once commanded through fear, now vulnerable in his grief, allowing himself to feel everything he had spent decades numbing with violence and false brotherhood. Rosa reached across the aisle and took Diego's hand, a simple gesture witnessed by everyone present, a physical manifestation of the forgiveness that continued rippling outward from that pivotal moment 3 years ago when Grace invaded a funeral designed for confrontation. When the priest invited attendees to share memories, Diego stood slowly, his voice steady despite tears, and spoke about how one woman's mercy at her son's funeral 15 years ago had planted seeds that took years to germinate, but eventually grew into gardens where redemption could finally flourish. Outside the chapel after the service, Miguel stood with Diego beside his mother's fresh grave as workers lowered the casket into earth that would cradle her final rest beneath trees she had loved during morning walks. They didn't speak immediately. These two men, connected by violence transformed into connection, by hatred redeemed through costly mercy that demanded everything and gave back even more than it required. Rosa joined them carrying flowers she had brought to place on the grave, her presence completing this unlikely trinity born from tragedy and refined through forgiveness that refused to accept violence as the final word. Diego knelt and placed his hand on the casket, thanking his mother for her love and thanking Rosa for showing him that another way existed beyond the only path he had known since childhood stole his options. Miguel realized, standing there, that his mother had taught him something no academy training could ever provide. That true courage lived not in tactical responses or successful operations, but in extending grace to those who deserved it least and needed it most desperately. Rosa looked between these two, men whose lives had become eternally intertwined through her willingness to forgive the unforgivable, and she smiled, knowing that her son, both biological and adopted through mercy, would carry this lesson forward into futures neither violence nor hatred could ever touch. The afternoon sun broke through autumn clouds, casting light across three figures standing together at a graveside where endings became beginnings, where one woman's death honored another woman's life, and where forgiveness continued writing stories that transformed funerals into resurrections and enemies into family, bound by something stronger than blood or gang allegiance could ever create. What would you do if mercy was the only weapon you had against violence? Subscribe to witness more stories where ordinary people create extraordinary change through courage.